got disconnected there. I'll reread that verse again. So the king sends Nehemiah back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall, and he also provides the lumber. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "And a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertain to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me." God has his hand upon him. The king not only allows Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and the gates, but he also helps him out, giving them the lumber that he needs. But just like Ezra, he's got those adversaries trying to stop him. Look down at verse 18. You had these people, they're trying to stop him. They're basically saying, you're rebelling against the king here, which is preposterous because he's doing exactly what the king told him to. He's got this letter proving it, and yet they're claiming, oh, you're rebelling against the king. Be rebelling against the king if he didn't go and build, rebuild the wall. But there in chapter 2, verse 18, Nehemiah tells his adversaries there, it says, "Then I told them of the hand of my God which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But," now here are the adversaries, "when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I them and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us, and therefore we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem." So the adversaries come up, claiming that he's rebelling, which he's doing just the opposite. So there in chapter 3 there, basically you've got a list of people there who are building, helping to rebuild repair the walls of Jerusalem. And I want you to take note that it's not just the common poor folks there, but you got some high up rulers that are doing it. Look at the verse 12 there, chapter 3, verse 12, mentioning the people that were rebuilding the wall. It says, "And next unto him repaired Shallum the son of Hallohesh, the ruler of the half part of Jerusalem, he and his daughter." So you have a ruler of half of Jerusalem there helping to rebuild the wall. Verses 14 through 19 go over several other rulers that repaired the walls of Jerusalem. Everybody's pitching in. The only ones who don't pitch in are the Tekoite nobles. If you look in chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "And next unto them the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord." But what's interesting about the Tekoites is they're the only ones mentioned that actually repair two parts of the wall. Look down in verse 27. Chapter 3, verse 27. "After them the Tekoites repaired a over against the great tower that lieth out even unto the wall of Ophel." So the only ones that aren't helping are the nobles of the Tekoites, and the Tekoites, they do double the work basically. Maybe they had smaller pieces of the wall, I don't know. But the point is they're able to repair two parts of the wall where everybody else just repairs one. So there in chapter 3 you get a list of those people who are repairing the wall of Jerusalem. And then in chapter 4 there, you have the adversaries. They come back up again, and they make the building of the wall more difficult, but yet the building continues. Song there in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth, and took great indignation, and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are built? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, Even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone walls." So he's just mocking them and saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. You just a little shaking of that wall, and it'll just fall down. And so they're mocking them. They're trying to say you can't do it. And basically what ends up happening in verses 6 through 10, you have half of the wall is built. Look there in verse 6, it says, "So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites of Jerusalem were made up, and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth, and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it." So they end up hindering the wall. There in verse 10 it says, "And Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall." So they built half of it. The adversary stopped them from continuing to build. If you hold your place there, go to Daniel chapter 9. If you've been in right division, you know Daniel chapter 9 has the famous passage of the 70 weeks, the last 490 years of Israel's history, basically, to bring in the Messiah, bring in the kingdom after those 490 years are up. If you look there in Daniel 9 verse 25, it says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks." So that's referring to the commandment that was given there in Nehemiah chapter 2. Unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 72 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So we're seeing that. You can go back to Nehemiah now. That's what you're seeing is the troublous times, rebuilding the wall here, according to Daniel's prophecy, chapter 9. Sure, they're going to rebuild it, but they're going to have some adversaries, and that's what you're seeing. They build half the wall. Well, before they even build the wall, you have them trying to stop them. And then when they get half the wall built, the adversaries come up again and stop them from building. Now notice their idea here in verse 11, the adversary's plan. It says there in chapter 4, verse 11, "And our adversary said, They shall not know, neither see, till we come in the midst among them, and slay them, and cause the work to cease." So their plan is to come into the midst and start killing off the people. And you can't really rebuild the wall if you're dead. So that's their idea, is if we kill them, they won't build anymore. And Nehemiah sees their plan. They're in verses 14 through 17. And he ends up taking half of the crew, and half of them can build the wall, and the other half are going to guard against these adversaries who are going to try to come in and destroy the work. So they're rebuilding the wall now. The work continues now, but it's only at half the crew there. So that's what, even you see him guarding the wall at night there in chapter 4, verse 22. It says, "Likewise at the same time said I unto the people, Let everyone with his servant lodge within Jerusalem, that in the night they may be a guard to us and labor on the day." So they have to guard this wall day and night, because adversaries can come in. What a perfect time to come in at night when no one's around and start tearing down the wall. It's a lot easier to tear down a wall than it is to build it up. So they got to stand guard to make sure their work isn't, their progress that they make isn't torn down. In chapter 5 here, you get a little diversion from that. Now you're told about the poverty and the famine that's going on. Remember I mentioned that the Jews who were left in the land that were not taken captive in Babylon were poor Jews. And then on top of that, you had God bringing that dearth or the famine as part of the chastisement of God upon Israel for their disobedience, for serving other gods. And so the people there were in bad shape. And not only that, but the Jews there, the rulers, Babylon, if you remember Nebuchadnezzar, he Jehoiachin as king, he took him captive. He took him out and put Zedekiah, his brother, on the throne. And so you had a Jew, Zedekiah, ruling there in Jerusalem. And so that's what you have here in chapter 5. You have Jews ruling over their brethren. And you would think they'd help them out, but they're really oppressing them even more. We'll read there in chapter 5, verse 1. "And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren the Jews. For there were that said, We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore we take up corn for them, that we may eat and live. Some also there were that said, We have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses, that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, We have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of the daughters are brought into bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards." So the people, the poor, oppressed Jews, make complaint to Nehemiah, basically saying, "It's great you're building this wall, but can you take care of us too?" You have these Jews who are ruling there, and they're oppressing these other Jews. And so Nehemiah steps in, and he's really angry at him. I mean, these people, they're having to sell their mortgage, their land, sell their crops, sell everything, just to be able to pay taxes and to be able to pay the high prices of the food, because food is expensive because of the famine. And so basically, Nehemiah, he gets the Jewish rulers to restore to the common Jews what they had taken. That's in verses 11 and 12. It says there in chapter 5, verse 11, "Restore, I pray you, to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, and their houses, also the 100th part of the money, and of the corn, the wine, and the oil that ye exact of them. Then said they, We will restore them, and will require nothing of them. So will we do as thou sayest. Then I called the priests, and took an oath of them that they should do according to this promise." So the point being here of chapter 5, you had these adversaries in chapter 4 that are stopping the progress of the wall. Now they're only down to half a staff, half of the people building the wall, because the other half to guard. Well, the Jews that are in the land, the ruling Jews, aren't helping either. They're distracting from the wall. They're not trying to stop the wall from being built, but they're distracting in the sense that Nehemiah has to go take part of his energy, part of his focus away from building the wall, and make sure these poor Jews don't starve to death. So again, this is Satan's attack to basically stop God's will from happening. And just as a side note, it's if you look at verse 7, it's actually biblical to have a conversation with yourself. So if you, like me, it's okay. Just quote Nehemiah 5:7. It says, "Then I consulted with myself, and I rebuked the nobles and the rulers, and said unto them, you exact usury every one of his brother. And I set a great assembly against them." Usury was interest. It was not allowed according to Jewish law. You could do it. The Jews could loan money and take interest from Gentiles, but they couldn't take it from their own. But yet they were doing that, so they were transgressing the law. And Nehemiah had a conversation with himself. So then Nehemiah chapter 5 verses 14 through 18 tell you that Nehemiah was governor of Judah for 12 years, and that's why they come to him. And in contrast to those people who were ruling, those Jews who were oppressing, he didn't burden them. He says, they're already burdened with the dearths in the land and everything, and so he doesn't try to burden them. But so he doesn't take money from them. He doesn't take taxes. It's a good as a side note. It's a good observation to make, because you'll have where you'll have people where the pastor will take the vast majority of the money that comes in for him to live on. And really the grace model is that you're supposed to give according as God has purposed, as you purpose in your heart to give, and not a tithe or anything like that. But you look at Paul. Paul didn't want to take money away from the people, because then they would say he was doing it for the money. Rather, he did a job himself on the side as a tent maker to make his living. Nehemiah does the same thing. As a governor, he had right to take taxes, to take money from the Jews. But he says, these people are burdened enough. Why should I just sit here in the governor's palace and not do anything? Rather, I'm going to be out there working, helping with the wall, helping take care of them, and I'm not going to take money from them. And it's a good lesson for pastors today if they can. I mean, obviously some cases they can't, but to follow the example. Not only does Nehemiah not take anything, but he also gives some things toward it. If you look in chapter 7 verse 70, Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 70, it says, referring to the building of the wall, it says, "And some of the chief of the fathers gave unto the work, the Tershatha gave to the treasure 1,000 drams of gold, 50 basins, 530 priests' garments." Well, you might think, well, who is the Tershatha? Well, if you look at Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 9, you learn that Nehemiah is him. It says chapter 8 verse 9, it says, "And Nehemiah, which is the Tershatha, and Ezra the priest, the scribe, and the Levites," and it goes on from there. So the point is that Nehemiah not only doesn't burden the people by making them pay the taxes that he could have collected from them if he wanted to. He doesn't. And he also helps in the building of the work of the wall by giving out of his own money to help in the building there. And he also relieves the oppression that those poor Jews had of the people who were ruling over them. So he does a lot of great work there. So then chapter 6 here, and you see, so chapter 4 you had the adversaries trying to stop the work of the wall. Chapter 5 you have the Jews, the ruling Jews, indirectly trying to stop the work of the rebuilding of the wall. Nehemiah takes care of that. Well, now chapter 6, you have the adversaries going at it again, trying to stop the work. But in chapter 6, the wall ends up being completed. Look there at chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall, and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gate. So he's almost done. It says, Then Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. They thought to do me mischief. So he's trying to delay the work. This is like a typical government thing. The government will say, all this bureaucratic red tape. Well, you got to get a building permit. Well, you got to do this. Well, you got to do that. Well, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to distract Nehemiah and say, come, let's meet together, talk about this. Nehemiah, he says, in verse 3, he says, I sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? So, he sees right through their plan there. So anyway, they try to stop there, and so what they end up doing, since he won't follow that plan, is they try to spread a lie to the king. Verse 7 there, it says, And thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem. These are false prophets. These are false prophets that these adversaries had appointed. They're trying to say like they're speaking for God. Look, I have my prophets, and they're saying, Thus saith the Lord. Really, they're just false prophets that they've hired to try to get them to prophesy, and then they're thinking, well, Nehemiah, he only listens to what the Lord says, so we'll show him, we'll hire these false prophets. The prophets will say, Thus saith the Lord, and then Nehemiah will follow him. And basically what they say is here that basically we're going to go tell the king on you if you don't stop. So there in verse 7 it says, And thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem, saying, There is a king in Judah. So in other words, they're saying they're going to go to the king and Media Persia and say, you got to stop this Nehemiah because he's formed a coup and is overthrowing you guys and going to set up his own kingdom here. That's the lie that they're going to spread. So there, verse 7, Thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem, saying, There is a king in Judah, and now shall it be reported to the king according to these words. Come now, therefore, and let us take counsel together. So, if you don't listen to us, we're going to spread this lie. Verse 8, Then I sent unto him, saying, There are no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest them out of thine own heart. For they all made us afraid, saying, Their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it be not done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. So he prays for God to help him in spite of this attack. Notice, if we continue reading, you'll see this. They even go farther by hiring a prophet who sort of gives a sign from verse 10. Afterward I came into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut up, and he said, Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night will they come to slay thee. So he's saying, Thus saith the Lord, they're going to kill you. Verse 11, And I said, Should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. And lo, I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me, for Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. So they've hired this guy to, he pretends to speak for God. He doesn't really, Nehemiah doesn't fall for the trick, so the work continues. And 52 days later, the wall is completed. And that's verse 15. Chapter 6, verse 15, it says, So the wall was finished in the 25th day in the month Elul, and 52 days. So despite the adversaries coming against him, despite the ruling Jews oppressing, God's will is still done. He is faithful to God's call to him, and he completes the work, and the wall of Jerusalem is built. Look at the reaction, though. Even after the wall is done, the adversaries are still against Nehemiah. There in verse 16 it says, And it came to pass that when all our enemies heard thereof, and all the heathen that were about us saw these things, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God. If you perceive that God is behind it, they should be rejoicing, saying, Well, I'm sorry that I tried to stop you. God's behind it, but they don't care about that. They're selfish. And so they're sad because they see that God was the one behind it. So their response, once they realize God is behind it, instead of giving glory to God and praising him, they send more letters there. In verse 17, Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters unto Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came unto them, for there were many in Judah sworn unto him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ezra, and his son Jehonan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds and uttered my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. So the wall is done, the work's completed, they know God's behind it, there's nothing they can do, and they're still trying to pester Nehemiah. So these are adversaries, and it really shows, who they're really, the one behind them is the true adversary himself behind this. So chapter 7, you get a list of those who came back to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity. The list is very similar to the list in Ezra chapter 2, which we went over last week. There are a few slight differences. For sake of time, I won't go over that. Basically, if you trust that God's word is God's word and that it's without error, then you can see, when you see those differences, you can figure out by comparing the verses that they're not really contradictions, but they're just a different way of stating things. But I did want to mention, you see that the wall is built there in verse 4. It says, not many people are in the city. It says during chapter 7, verse 4, now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded. So they built the wall. They were successful in that, but still you had the famine, and you had, they've been oppressed, and so the city, there aren't that many people. Most of the Jews were killed, or they're in captivity in Babylon. They're not here in Jerusalem at this time. But the wall is built, and so the work that God gave Nehemiah to do is done. I also wanted to note one difference here between Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. So if you'll turn to Ezra 2 and keep Nehemiah 7 at the same time, at the end of these long list of names, which I won't attempt to pronounce, I know you probably love to hear me try that, but if you look in Ezra chapter 2, talking about, let's see, in my notes here, verse 68, Ezra chapter 2, verse 68, it says, and some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So this is what they gave to build the house of God. Remember, Ezra is concerned with building the house of God. And then if you go over to Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 70, here's told, and some of the chief of the fathers gave unto the work, the Tirshatha gave to the treasure 1,000 drams of gold, 50 basins, 530 priests' garments. And some of the chief of the fathers gave to the treasure of the work 20,000 drams of gold and 2,200 pounds of silver. So they don't give as much. The chief of the fathers don't give as much here as in Ezra 2. And that's where people who don't believe the Bible anyway will see, the Bible is full of contradictions, because Ezra 2 says they gave 61,000 drams of gold, and Nehemiah chapter 7 says they gave 20,000 drams of gold. Obviously, God didn't inspire it, or if he did, he's fallible, he's with error. But the case is there are two different subjects here. Basically, the offering taken up here by the chief of the fathers, the offering that they gave in Ezra, was for building the house of the Lord. The offering that they gave to Nehemiah was for the building of the wall of Jerusalem. So it's two different works, so it's two different offerings. So even though you've got a similar list here of the people that came back to the land from Babylon, same people came back, but they gave different offerings for different things. And so it's not a contradiction in your Bible. It's just, in fact, it shows you, proof, just another proof that it's God behind it, because, God is doing different things here. God's doing His will. And so there are different gifts for different things. We got to move a little bit faster. Chapter 8 is where Israel hears the law, and they keep the Feast of Booths, B-O-O-T-H-S, Booths. First off, what's great is there in chapter 8, verse 1, it says, and all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate, and they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. So you talk about a preacher's dream right there.